Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ansman Performance. So today we're going to talk about anatomical differences and how these affect throwing mechanics. All right, so let's dive into it. So I think kind of a little bit of background on what we do at Tyler Ansman Performance. So we're a data-driven company, and with an understanding of kind of biomechanics and motor learning and these kinds of things guiding development, we individualize programs for each of our athletes to kind of help kind of get them along to kind of where they want to go. Okay, so kind of diving into this then. So let's kind of start with hip structure and lower body mechanics and how kind of this impacts what we're looking at from a throwing standpoint. So there's basically three kind of classifications that kind of broadly encompass the femoral kind of acetabulum relationship. And so essentially how kind of that upper leg bone sits in that hip socket. All right, so we have kind of anteversion, which means that they're kind of structurally biased towards internal rotation. All right, and so we can kind of see that in B on the image, kind of here on the slideshow. And then retroversion, kind of structurally biased towards external rotation. All right, and we can kind of see that in C. All right, and so one of the things that you'll be able to see kind of when you're seeing somebody walking is that anteverted guys are going to tend to be your more pigeon-toed guys, and the kind of retroverted guys are going to tend to be your more kind of duck-footed guys who will walk with their feet kind of out. And then neutral, they'll have kind of even access to internal rotation and external rotation based on kind of their structure. All right, and so this is kind of really important because when we're talking about what we do to kind of impact mobility, range of motion, those kinds of things, these structural limitations are really important to kind of keep in mind, because if we're going up against bony blocks, like, we're not going to be able to make meaningful change there. We're more likely to just kind of cause pain, discomfort, those kinds of things. All right, so in terms of kind of anteverted hip structure, all right, so what we're going to kind of see with these guys is the goal is really to kind of wind tension and remove slack, and this is kind of broadly true across pitching mechanics and other kind of complex movements. What we're really trying to do is kind of place a stretch on these kind of connective tissue structures, all right, and then we're going to allow that kind of rebound effect to happen kind of out of these kind of pre-stretch movements. And so structure will determine kind of how these movements should occur to kind of make this happen. And so anteverted guys, so kind of Edwin Diaz here is a pretty good example of this. What you'll see is kind of those guys coiling this pelvis over top of the femur. And so what you'll see is kind of this almost like counter rotating of the pelvis on top of this femur, and that's driving basically internal rotation. And so this kind of helps these guys remove slack. All right. And so kind of the next piece to this, right, is as they land, you could see these guys land in kind of a more of a cross body position. They may step across their body more than most, and it may not necessarily be a problem because they do have such excellent internal rotation to kind of get across that. And so this was something that we kind of saw previously in Orioles pitcher turned Cubs pitcher Jake Arrieta. And when he was with the Orioles, one of the things that he kind of mentioned that he always had problems with was a couple of things. One, they were always kind of fighting him on stepping across his body. And obviously, totally new regime there now. So not the people who are currently in charge of the Orioles, but they were always kind of fighting him on he stepped across his body, and they wanted to change that. They also took away his cutter. So they did some other things that kind of put him in a tough spot. So he went to the Cubs. He was like, hey, I'm going to pitch the way I need to pitch. And obviously, he kind of turned into a Cy Young winner there and had the best seasons of his career. And so we don't want to be fighting against guys' structure just because something looks a little bit wonky, right? If these guys can make it work, it may be something that actually is driving their success rather than inhibiting that success. And so kind of the next piece to this is that landing across the body may actually be necessary for some of these guys because their hip internal rotation is so great and they're so biased towards that in order to kind of keep the pelvis from over rotating, right, kind of towards that first base line, they may need to land cross body in order to kind of take that slack out on landing and have this kind of position where we can kind of drive kind of that energy up the chain back into the torso, right? Effectively kind of stop and transfer that energy into foot strike. So important things to kind of think about. Retroverted guys, all right? So these will tend to be, generally speaking, we're going to kind of get to this later on, but these will tend to be kind of your more muscle-driven guys usually. Not always the case, but usually. And so Trevor Rosenthal's a pretty decent example of this. He's got this retroverted structure. right? They tend to kind of prefer a more neutral pelvis and relative external rotation on the back hip, right? So you can kind of see on his back hip, right? This pelvis stays pretty neutral as he's going down the mound, all right? And we kind of maintain this relative external rotation of the femur as he's kind of holding this position. And the rear shin doesn't need to stay perfectly vertical, right? That may not be optimal for all guys. Some guys, may do well with that, but we are likely to see somewhat of an angle as they kind of come down the mound. And if they try to stay perfectly vertical, it may make it impossible for some of these guys to effectively shift the center of mass. All right. And so while holding this tension and shifting the center of mass, you may kind of see this angle happen a little bit. And that's perfectly acceptable as long as he's able to kind of maintain that tension. And so the lead hip will tend to kind of open early, right? This kind of lead leg. All right. But this pelvis should maintain relatively closed. All right. And kind of post foot strike pelvis rotation will kind of finish off that hip rotation, right? So he's gonna land with this foot relatively open. It's going to open pretty early in the movement, and then this pelvis is going to kind of finish that kind of hip rotation piece of it as we go through there. All right, so again, many of these athletes are going to be somewhere in the middle. There's not really going to be one extreme or the other necessarily, but principles for both can kind of be helpful in order to understand the bandwidths of acceptable movement. All right, and this is kind of important to think about, is that generally we're going to see guys somewhere towards the middle of the road, not one extreme or the other necessarily. All right, so kind of next we'll move on to shoulder structuring. So this is kind of going to be some of the things that we talk about, and this will make a little bit more sense as we get into it. But kind of a logical place to talk about is kind of evolution and chimps versus humans, and what this looks like in terms of humans as kind of hunters as they continue to evolve, and why we throw so much better than our very close relatives, the chimpanzees. So what you'll see is, humans throw significantly better than chimpanzees, even though chimps are very strong and very athletic. They throw relatively poorly, and structure is one of these reasons. And so we can kind of see over here, right? We have the chimp kind of shoulder complex structure, and over here we have the human shoulder complex structure. Chimp scapula, human scapula. And what you'll see is that humans are much more horizontally oriented, all right? And this structure works better, right, with the line of pull for the pec and some of these other fibers that are the main accelerators for the arm during throwing. And so what you'll kind of see is that the lower shoulders, more horizontal orientation, allows the arm to be pulled through by the pec more effectively. All right, and this is one of the things that we kind of talk about with the arm being in plane, right? The chimp is going to tend to have his arm kind of way up here, so we'll be rotating through the plane of the shoulders, right? But we're not going to be effectively kind of transferring that energy into the arm because the plane of rotation is just, kind of the arm is out of plane significantly by being so vertical like that. And it's just the orientation of the shoulder here. Whereas humans, right, we can more easily get this arm into the plane of shoulder rotation and thus kind of capture that rotational energy, allow the pec to pull the arm through, and we have kind of significant advantages in terms of throwing relative to our very close relatives there. All right, so the next piece is glenohumeral internal rotation deficit, or GERD. So this is one of those things that's like kind of lasted for too long of a time in terms of being thought of as a pathology. It's still treated as a problematic thing in kind of some physical therapy offices and doctor offices, which is an issue really, because there's research kind of showing that it's not. And so what basically happens is when we're looking at internal and external rotation, we need to kind of think about this total arc of motion here, right? So from full internal rotation to full external rotation, what does that look like? And what we're looking for is that it's within, about 10 degrees on each side. If we're outside that range, then we may need to kind of examine things, but it won't be because we're just missing internal rotation necessarily. Because what's going to happen as young throwers kind of kind of closing of the growth plates, what happens is the shoulder becomes more biased towards external rotation because we'll see torsion and retroversion happen. And this is prior to the growth plates closing. So generally young kids, if they're throwing consistently and throwing, reasonably hard consistently, we're going to see this kind of adaptation happen. And this is one of the reasons that I think almost anybody can, train to throw 90 miles an hour and probably get there if they're willing to kind of do all that it takes to get there. However, if they didn't start playing baseball until they're 15 or 16 years old, unless they're 6'8", they're probably going to have some significant problems getting there just because of this adaptation not happening. And so the reason this can be so helpful is because we have this kind of greater range of motion as we go through layback. And we do, there is research to suggest that, one of the differences between kind of high and low velocity guys is that kind of range and layback, whereas the low velocity group tends to be closer to about 160 degrees, and the higher velocity group tends to be very close to 180 degrees, right? And we can kind of see this in some of the hard throwing guys when we look at that kind of those layback still images. And it doesn't mean that this will, definitely limit you from throwing hard. There are other things you can do to kind of make up for it that we'll talk about later, but it is a helpful adaptation, not just in terms of performance and allowing kind of a greater arc of motion for force to be applied to the baseball, but it also can be helpful in terms of health because it allows the soft tissues of the anterior shoulder to kind of stay in their elastic range, perform better as stabilizers, so we don't get kind of these little injuries and things happening because we're taking these kind of structures out of their ideal range. So kind of the next piece in terms of structure is a flat thoracic spine. And so this is going to be very helpful for layback and rotation. All right. And the thoracic spine needs the ability to flex as well, though. This is kind of one of those limitations. So we can see kind of a flat spine over here. And it can also, it can get mistaken for scapular dyskinesia a lot of times because it looks like, this isn't a great illustration of that, but it can look like kind of they're winging, but really what's happening is we're not filling in this gap very well because we really don't do a good job of kind of keeping that, as Eric Cressy calls it, that convex concave relationship with the scapula and the rib cage. And so what can happen here is we're limited in our ability to flex, we're limited in our ability to kind of protract. All right, and we're limited in our ability to upwardly rotate. And so these are going to be guys that may struggle with that. And what we can see is problems at kind of the glenohumeral joint, all right, can occur due to kind of poor scapulohumeral rhythm. And so what that basically means is that the shoulder blade, right, and this upper arm bone essentially aren't moving well together, because what we should see is this, as this kind of arm goes overhead, we should see the scapula kind of upwardly rotate as well. And if we're limited through here because we have, some weakness going on, especially in the serratus anterior, among others, in the low trap as well, we can see kind of some real problems in terms of getting to positions to be able to kind of throw hard. All right, so the next piece to this is kind of the position and the tilt of the scapula. You can see these really low shoulders, very depressed scapula here. And this does tend to be adaptive because of the repeated movements that we're seeing. And so this can be from throwing especially, right? The lat is very, very active, and the lat is a scapular depressor, so it's going to pull that shoulder blade down over time. So we need to do things to kind of, give those other kind of structures, muscles, movements, some love. And so one of the things that we don't need to be doing is doing tons of farmer's walks and pull-ups and lat pull-downs and things like that are just driving more and more depression, right? We need to do some stuff that kind of gets guys out of these positions. So these would be guys who are better candidates for a lot more horizontal pulling, a lot more reaching and rounding and things like that. And they definitely need some of that low trap work, right? Because the lat is very much overpowering that. And so what's going to happen is lat and serratus anterior as well, because these guys are going to be at a disadvantage in terms of getting to that full upward rotation just because of that starting point. And so, we need movements that drive more posterior tilt, more kind of upward rotation, things like that. So the low trap, serratus anterior are going to be key areas of focus for these guys to make sure that we can really kind of get them back to a position where they're able to move productively, kind of how we're asking them to. All right, so kind of the next piece to this is going to be very broad, but athlete archetypes. So we kind of have tight versus loose movers. There's a lot of ways to classify guys, right? Muscular versus elastic, force versus fascial driven, like all of these kinds of things. And we're essentially kind of getting at the same thing here. But essentially, like, what we're looking at is how far do these guys have to go to remove slack, right? This is kind of the name of the game across the board in all of these kind of mechanical pieces. All right. Go to the end range, hit the curb, rebound out of it, right? We need to leverage connective tissue. So it's all about stretch and rebound. How do we get there? And different guys are going to do that in different ways, and they'll have kind of different optimal strategies. All right, so tight movers, right? These guys don't need to go as far to remove slack. All right, so up top, tight mover, Noah Syndergaard. Bottom, more loose mover, Billy Wagner. And so what's going to happen is our bigger, stronger guys will tend to be tighter movers, right? More muscle tissue. They have these kind of longer levers, so it's less important that they find these really deep ranges of motion because they're going to be able to apply force to the ball over such a large arc of motion anyway, just because their arms are so long, right? So they can really kind of make up for that lack of range with longer levers. Whereas guys, the smaller guys like Billy Wagner, they need to kind of get everything they can out of their bodies. So you see this extreme layback, this really extreme kind of thoracic extension, and this pretty solid kind of global flexion of the torso over that front leg is going to give him more time to kind of apply force to the ball, and that's something that he's really going to need to do. All right, so then we have looser movers. So these guys will tend to go to pretty deep positions to remove slack. So Justin Verlander is an interesting combo because he's not a loose mover up top, but in his lead leg, we can see that he generally will go to kind of hyperextension to remove slack from that front leg and effectively kind of transfer energy up the chain into the upper body and ultimately into the arm. Whereas a guy like Trevor Rosenthal, obviously these aren't synced to the same spot, so it's not as easy to see, but he will tend to leave some flexion in that lead leg, and that's totally fine as long as he's still able to stop, reverse direction, right, and transfer that energy effectively up into the torso, which he does do very well. So, not everyone needs to get to this kind of hyperextended position or even should get to this hyperextended position to kind of find those end ranges where we're going to get kind of all the slack out of there, right? The more elastic guys will tend to be kind of your thinner who rely on sequencing and bounce for high velocities rather than these really kind of great muscular forces. All right, so part of the assessment process for this is going to be, Craig's test. All right, so we're kind of looking at what does end range, passive hip external and internal rotation look like? What do hip flexion extension look like? Shoulder external internal rotation. We're going to look at their posture. So we talked about kind of that flat thoracic spine. All right, and then we're going to do their force velocity profile and their elastic utilization ratio. All of this stuff we're going to talk about in a kind of a future presentation, just so you kind of know what that is, some of the pieces of the assessment process will look like. All right, so training considerations, right, in terms of drill selection. So drill selection and cueing can kind of be determined by athlete type and anatomy, right? So we may, kind of have the same drill for two guys who are on different ends of the spectrum, but they'll be kind of cued differently, right? So anteverted guys and retroverted guys may both use step backs, right? But the anteverted guys will in some cases be cued to coil more, right? To kind of take that slack out, whereas retroverted guys may be cued to keep a more neutral pelvis, right? The depth of kind of how far they sit into that squat and hinge may differ a little bit as well, right? So all of these pieces, but they can use the same drill. We're just going to cue them a little bit differently, kind of based on their anatomy. All right, the other piece is we kind of need to find these positions rhythmically and in a relaxed manner to kind of set up these elastic tissues to do their job, right? Because if we're getting to these, really deep end ranges, like that's awesome, but if we're doing it in a really stiff way, we're kind of muscling our way there, it's going to be a problem for, kind of setting up these elastic tissues to really get that kind of maximal stretch and rebound out of that. We're essentially going to be also firing some of these muscles out of order. So we're not going to get this kind of wave-like building of the sequencing. All right, so loose movers will tend to be more consistent with their outputs because they're a little bit less nervous system driven. The readiness from day to day isn't going to fluctuate their outputs quite as much because they're so efficient with their movements. But our kind of muscle driven, tighter movers, really nervous system driven guys are going to see these much bigger fluctuations in output and need to be managed more carefully. And so these may be guys who we use kind of different frequencies of throwing with as a consideration for, kind of what works better in terms of kind of maximizing that readiness, each weekend or whatever game they're going to be pitching, for these guys. So kind of the next, one of the next pieces to consider is, program design and periodization. And so we kind of talked about this in the beginning, but bony blocks aren't going to change. So, trying to kind of change these things when there's a bony block present is going to cause more harm than good. We really don't want to fight against an anatomy and their dominant strategy when it comes to kind of how they move best. So, right, we're not going to make elastic guys muscle driven, and we're not going to make muscle driven guys elastic. Like, they may need a little bit more of one thing than the other, right? Elastic guys may need to get a little bit stronger, so we need to kind of program a little bit differently in the gym. And our muscle driven guys may need to get a little bit more elastic, so we need to program, more, extensive plyometrics and rhythm based things for those guys. But we're never going to pull them so far that they never, get to touch their strengths again, right? Farther from the season, we can work more on weaknesses, but closer to the season, we really got to make sure we're kind of leaning on those strengths to kind of potentiate guys, right? It's working on stuff that's going to kind of help you shore up those weaknesses versus potentiating your performance on the field. So your force dominant guys are going to thrive on high force. So lean into that. That's what a potentiating session is going to look like. Elastic athletes aren't going to lift the house, right? We don't want to overload them and kill their bounce. These are guys who, maybe deep squats don't work as well for, right? Maybe it's a trap bar deadlift or a half squat or things like that. And we're leaning more into kind of those unilateral movements for these guys to drive more of that strength, kind of effect. But loading their spine super heavy may not be the best thing either, right? So you have to kind of consider these things when we're talking about what are the differences between these athletes. So kind of closing thoughts. Assessments are key. In season, changes can become much harder because in some cases, we're trying to make really big changes. Reductions in performance are going to be necessary, but they're not optimal at this point. So, that's not to say we can't make tons of progress in season, because we absolutely can. But this isn't where you're going to be overhauling somebody. This is where you're going to be, kind of making these tweaks as you go and kind of still making sure they can perform, on the weekends or in the midweek game, whatever their role is. In season, we're going to lean into strengths so we can potentiate. In the off season, that's really when we're going to kind of shore up those weaknesses. So those are kind of the big things here. If you have questions, feel free to kind of drop them in the comments below. Feel free to shoot me an email. If remote training is something that you're interested in, feel free to kind of apply through our website. And if you have anything else, feel free to reach out. But thanks for watching, and looking forward to seeing you in the next video. Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you're interested in some guidance in your own career and some help getting to the next level, let us build your program for you. So the way this will work is we'll take you through an entire assessment process, going through your mobility and movement screening. We'll take you through a mechanical analysis as well, based on about 60 points that we've built out to kind of decide where your greatest areas of opportunity are. And then we'll also go through a force velocity profile so we can help build out your strength and conditioning plan. With this in mind, we'll build out an entire plan for you based around all of your kind of areas of need, weakness, and opportunity based on your time of year and working with your current school schedule if that becomes an issue. You'll have access to your coach every day with unlimited text and email support, and a video library for kind of any issues that you have with the movements. We'll also check in weekly to see how your throwing is going. And we will kind of guide you through the entire process. If you're interested in this, shoot us an email or kind of check out the informational page on the website if you have any questions. Thanks.